Assalamualaikum and hi everyone. So let's go through the sample answers for lab test 2. Going through the question, it says over here the company pays its employees based on the number of hours they work in a week. The rate per hour depends on the type of the employees. So over here in the table we have employee type A, B, C and then the hourly rate 150, 150. And then it says if the employee works more than 40 hours, then they would be paid the overtime rate. Any excess hours above the 40 hours, the overtime rate is 100 per hour, regardless of the type of employee. If the employee is a member of the workers' union, they must pay a fee of 50 ringgit per week. So you need to write a program that can calculate and print the weekly pay for its employees for type A, B and C. It says here the gross pay is the amount of pay before the union's fee is deducted, and the net pay is the amount of pay after the union fee is deducted. And given are two running samples of the GUI. In the GUI, user can enter the employee ID, hours works, employee type, whether A, B, C, and if the user or the employee has the workers' union membership or not. So when the user clicks on display pay, it will calculate what is the gross pay, what is the net pay and display it in the text area. If the user click on clear, then the text area and the text fields will be cleared. Continuing with the question, so the application has two classes, employee and pay calculator user interface, as shown in the UML class diagram below. And then it says pay calculator UI creates an employee object to calculate the employee's gross pay and net pay. The constructor takes in 4 input, which are the employee ID, hours work, employee type and also the membership status. The two methods, compute gross pay and also compute net pay methods, those methods would calculate and return the employee's gross pay and net pay. And then going on to the pay calculator UI class, it has display button action perform, where it handles the display pay button. In this method, it would read 4 input, creates the employee object, and then get the gross pay and net pay by calling the compute gross pay method and also compute net pay method. Still in the display button action perform, it will display the employee information in the text area. And in the table, it shows the GUI component and also the variable name for those components. So going to the question, it says over here, complete the definition of employee constructor method below. So it gave the class name. So over here, it should be employee, not employee 1. And then it has the private string, emp ID, hours, type, member, and also the constant for rate A, rate B, and rate C. So you don't have to write 150, 100, and also 50 because these are given. So you are going to call it by calling rate A, rate B, and also rate C. In the first question, we are not going to use the rate yet. So we are just going to fill up the constructor. The constructor has 4 input, public employee, string, emp ID, double hours, string type, and also the boolean member. So whatever the user input, we would want to save it inside our private variable, that is the emp ID, hours, type, and member. They are using the same name. So in our constructor, we would write it straight away, this.empid equal to empid, right? Because the this.empid would refer to our private string empid, and the empid at the back of it that refers to whatever the user input. So the same goes for other variables. So we have this.hours equal to hours, this.type equal to type, and this.member equal to member. In case you are still confused with using the keyword this, you can try and run this code and see what happens if you don't write this in front of it. If say that you write emp_id equal to emp_id, it will just refer your emp_id as whatever the user input. It will not refer to the global variable. And by global variable, I mean the class variable, which is your private string emp_id. Going to the next question, it says complete the definition of the compute gross pay method below. So to answer this one, you should refer back to the description given in the question. So I put over here, it says that if an employee works more than 40 hours, they will be paid an overtime rate for the number of excess hours. And the overtime rate is RM100 per hour, regardless of the type of employee. And to calculate the gross pay, it is the amount of pay before the union's fee is deducted. And also in this question, we are going to use our constant. So to calculate the gross pay, we have three types of employee, A, B, C. And then we have to calculate as well if the employee works 40 hours and also what is the overtime rate if they work more than 40 hours. So we would use our if-else inside of this. You can also use switch if you want. For this question, you have to look at the method and then see if it has any return type. So in here, we have public double compute gross pay. So we have the return type double. So at the end of that method, you have to return something back. The sample answer for this question, you can write something like this. So we have if type dot equal to A, and then if hours is larger equal than 40, meaning that overtime. So you would have 40 times with read A plus with hours minus 40, that is the overtime hours, times with 100 because the overtime rate is 100 regardless of the type. Then we have our else, meaning that if the employee does not work overtime, then the gross pay is basically how many hours they work times it with the rate. You would write it something similar for type dot equals B and also type dot equals C. The only difference is the rate that you use, right? So you would use the constant for type A as rate A, for type B rate B, and also for type C is the constant of rate C. And then at the end of it, you need to return the gross pay. Another thing that you need to be aware of, because we have our constant and our constant is final, that means that our rate A, rate B, and rate C, you cannot change it anywhere in your code. It will give you an error. When you use final, that means that that is the final value that it should have. So question C, it says complete the definition of compute net pay method. If we refer back to the description in the question, it says that for compute pay, net pay is the amount of pay after the union's fee is deducted. And this relates back whether the employee is a member of the workers' union or not. If they are a member of the workers' union, then they must pay the union fee of RM50 per week. In this question, you are going to use the if-else, and then you need to be aware that the method, which is public double compute net pay, so it should return a double. So in this if statement, we can write if member equal to true. So remember that member is type boolean. So when it's type boolean, it's either true or false. If you look back at the GUI, it gives you the option yes or no. You need to be careful with that kind of detail. So for this question, you would write if member equal to true, then net pay equal to gross pay minus with 50. Else net pay is equal to gross pay, meaning that you are not deducting the RM50. And then you would return the net pay. Question D, it says complete the definition of the display button action perform method in the pay calculator UI class. In the description, it says this method it would handle the display pay button. It reads 4 inputs, creates the employee object, and gets the gross pay and net pay by calling the compute gross pay and compute net pay methods. And then it will display the employee information in the output text area. So quite a lot of things that this method would do. Let's do the first part first. So it says reads the 4 input. So this is based on whatever the user input or whatever the user click. In our GUI, the user can select whether they are a member of the union. So we can have our if else over there. So we can write if yes radio button is selected, then the member is true, else member is false. And then another thing that the user can select, which is the workers type, whether it's A, B, or C. So we can have our if else at that part as well. So we would write if A type radio button is selected, then type is equal to A. So two ways of doing it. You can write type equal to A, or you can also write type equal A type radio button dot get text. It will still give you the same result. Else, if it's not type A, then it could be type B. If it's not type B, then you have another else. It should be type C. For the workers type, we can use .get text. What about the yes or no radio button? Can we use get text? The answer is no, because if you look at the GUI over here, we have the workers union membership is either yes or no. If you use get text, it will display yes and also no. But our member is type boolean. It's not a string. That's why you cannot use get text. Okay, so we've done the first part. The second part, it says creates the employee object. So you can write employee A, or call it whatever you want, equal to new employee. In our constructor, we take in 4 input. So it should be in the correct order. So ID, hours, type, and member. Going back to the description, it says inside this method, you need to get the gross pay and net pay by calling the compute gross pay and compute net pay methods. Two ways of doing it. The first one, you can call the methods and give it to any variable. As what I did over here, I wrote double pay equal a dot compute gross pay. You can call the method straight away inside your output text area. For example, in the output text area dot set text, at the last part, I wrote a dot compute net pay pay. Right? So that is calling the method straight away. And the last thing that we need to do is display the employee information in the output text area. So that is the line that I wrote output ta.setText. So it will display the employee ID. It calls the variable ID. Hours work are, and then call the hours. Employee type is, calls the type. And then we have gross pay. It calls the pay because I call the method compute gross pay, and whatever value that is, I put it in the variable called pay. And then net pay, and I call the method compute net pay and give it the value pay, whatever that value is. See that your compute gross pay, whatever that value is, you are not keeping it in any variable. So when you call your compute net pay, you would write it as a.compute net pay, and then inside the bracket, you would write compute gross pay. So that means that you are calling a method within another method. Last question. It says complete the definition of clear button action perform method in the pay calculator UI class. So in this method, we basically want to clear everything. For the text field, we would use .setText and then write nothing to it, just empty string. So we would do that for ID text field and also hours text field. For our radio button, we need to do it one by one. So we have A type radio button dot set selected, set it to false. We would do the same for B type radio button, C type radio button, and also our yes and no radio buttons. For our text area that we call as output TA, we need to clear that part as well. So we would write output TA.setText empty string. And that's all for all the questions in lab test 2.